Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in this morning. I'm anxious to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. And yesterday we began our discussions about this most diabolical Pope of the counterfeit Church of Christ, Antichrist Pope Boniface VIII. And we'll continue. I'm going to back up one paragraph for continuity purposes, and we'll begin the first full paragraph on page 420 if you're following along in the book. Boniface, speaking of Boniface VIII, made a cruel and unjustifiable war upon the family of the Colonnas. There were two cardinals of this family, and these he drove out of Italy, despoiling their property and seizing their castles. He quarreled with Philip, King of France, about his affair with the Earl of Flanders, one of his own subjects, and threatened to interdict the kingdom unless he would recognize his temporal power over him. Now the Pope issuing more papal thunder, threatening an interdict of his kingdom, sometimes includes moratoriums on the church. In other words, they just simply close down the churches, and nobody can get married, nobody can get baptized. And in the Roman Catholic Church, if a baby is born and not baptized, and if it dies, it goes into limbo or purgatory. And as a matter of fact, when these interdicts took place, the churches were closed down. There were no burials of Christians who died because the funerals had to take place in the churches. You see, so it was a very, very painful thing for Roman Catholics in a Roman Catholic country when the Pope issued an interdict. And so this is serious business for those in France who were Roman Catholic and deceived. And France was a Roman Catholic country, though it quarreled with the papacy time after time after time. Anyway, he quarreled with Philip, King of France, about his affair with the Earl of Flanders, one of his own subjects, and threatened to interdict the kingdom unless he would recognize his temporal power over him. He commanded the clergy of France not to pay anything to the king for the support of the government without his consent. Okay? More power of more temporal power. In other words, you can just tell people not stop paying taxes. Don't support the government financially. Okay? Now, he declared in a bull issued for the purpose that, quote, God had established him over kings and kingdoms to pluck up, to destroy, to scatter, to build. That the King of France ought not to think he has no superior and is not subject to the Pope. That he who is of that opinion is a fool and an infidel, unquote. He addressed himself thus to Philip, quote, Boniface the bishop, a servant of the servants of God, to Philip, King of France, fear God and keep his commandments. Now, which God do you think Boniface was talking about? Himself, right? The papacies have always claimed that they were, as it were, God on earth, and that to obey God means to obey the Pope. And in this direct order to Philip, the King of France, the Pope said, fear God and keep his commandments, meaning fear the Pope and keep his commandments. Now, we will you to know that you are subject to us, he continues, both in spirituals and in temporals. We declare them heretics who believe the contrary, unquote. Here was an act, says R.W. Thompson, here was an act ex cathedra from the chair of Peter and concerning the faith. So it's as if God was himself speaking. It's binding upon the church. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, it is binding on the church. Everyone must assent to it, okay, on pain of excommunication and eternal damnation. It was performed by an infallible Pope and therefore binds the faithful no less now than the day on which the bull Boniface VIII was issued. No less today, this very day in 2012, it is still binding on the Roman Catholic Church, this bull of Boniface VIII. And it says, the king, the dukes, earls, and barons of France united in a protest against these extraordinary demands, and the Assembly of the States resolved that France was not subject to the Pope in temporals. France, when it rebels, it always says, well, we'll leave you to be the bishop of our bishops. We'll leave you with your ecclesiastical authority as head of the church, but you're not messing around in our governmental affairs, in the way we live our lives. Okay? And look, it is through the governments of the world that the papacy asserts all its power. So if anyone, France included, tries to separate the government of the nation from the authority of the Pope, in other words, casting off the Pope's temporal authority, he's literally destroyed the papacy's power to dictate or to impose Roman Catholic canon law and his will, that is, his law, upon the people. Anytime it is attempted anywhere in history, anywhere in the world, of separating the Pope from his claim to temporal authority, results in war. The Pope maintains his temporal power by war, among other ways, and we'll talk about those as we continue in the book too. Now, the prelates, these French Roman Catholic prelates, also interfered on the side of Philip. In other words, these Roman Catholic bishops didn't want the Pope imposing his will in temporals in France. They wanted to obey the king, King Philip. And these bishops, or these prelates, also interfered on the side of Philip and addressed Boniface in favor of reconciliation. The Pope, in reply, declared that the doctrine of the French Assembly was, quote, schismatical because it tends to the establishment of two supreme heads, and he summoned the French prelates to Rome. Now, have you ever heard the phrase, the cliche phrase, anything with two heads is a monster? It's usually said in relations to the family, man and wife. The family, if it has two heads, is a monster. It's usually in in defense of the man's biblical role in the family. Okay, but it's the same cliche phrase that the papacy would use if a nation should decide to separate the Pope from his temporal power and there be a Pope over spirituals and a king over temporals. That meaning that the nation would have two heads, and it would be a monster. The Pope asserts that the king rules at the Pope's behest and imposes the Pope's will upon the people, there being then only one head of the nation. Okay. So again, Pope Boniface VIII asserts, when the French bishops rose up against the papacy in defense of their sovereign king, Philip, Boniface VIII thundered back and said that they were schismatical and that what they were proposing tended to establish two supreme heads in the nation, making it a monster. Now, this was forbidden by the king, and the controversy became exceedingly angry on both sides, one party asserting and the other denying the temporal authority of the Pope in France. Boniface convened a consistory in Rome wherein one of the cardinals spoke, quote, boldly of the authority of the Pope over temporalities of the kings. And Boniface did the same, insisting that he had the right to depose the king. The king, on his part, listened to severe accusations against the Pope made by Nogaret, wherein he was charged with heresy, simony, robbing churches, tyranny, blasphemy, extortion, and many other crimes, and we must know that they were true because historically that's been the case, and Rome doesn't even deny it. Now, the Pope then issued his famous bull, Unum Sanctum. You can look that up in Google, and it's just good to do your own research so that you own this information. It's not just spoon-fed to you. Familiarize yourself with this bull, Unum Sanctum. The Pope then issued this famous bull, Unum Sanctum, which was also an act ex cathedra, part of the faith of the Church. In this bull he declares, quote, that the Church, which is one, has two swords, one spiritual and the other temporal, that the temporal is subject to the spiritual, and that none can deny this truth without admitting of two supreme heads with the Manichees, unquote. In other words, you're a heretic. Now, we've talked about this before on Inquisition Update. For the new listeners, though, you want to take a look at the Vatican flag. It is a papal tiara with two keys beneath it, in the recognizable fashion of a skull and crossbones. Okay, the papal tiara showing the three crowns, the Pope's authority over heaven, over the earth, and over hell or purgatory, and then the two keys representing the two swords of the Roman Catholic Church. One the ecclesiastical or the spiritual, and the other the temporal sword of the Church, and they're bound together. Normally, they are bound together in these pictorial representations as being bound with a red cord, a scarlet cord. And they cannot be separated without shedding blood. And that is proven in history. Every attempt made to separate the Pope's temporal sword from his spiritual sword winds up in bloodshed. Now, R.W. Thompson continues, he says, we've already seen elsewhere the precise wording of this bull, and also that Pope Pius IX has in his encyclical declared it to be yet a part of the canon law, as containing principles by which his own pontifical conduct is regulated. So in short, what Pope Pius IX did in his encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864 was simply reiterate all these tenets just expressed by Pope Boniface VIII to France. There's no separation of the spiritual and the temporal swords. Every king must answer to the Pope, and every king must rule the people according to the Pope's canon law. In other words, just to be his proxy over the people. And if one suggests otherwise, then the nation has two heads. It's a monster. And there's going to be conflict. And history proves there always is. Now, Pope Pius IX issued his encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864 and reiterated all these points. And it remains only in this connection to be seen that Boniface VIII, by virtue of his claim of infallibility, made it a part of the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Dupin says, quote, this Pope caused to be composed and published a new body of decretals. Here we go, another addition to these pseudo-Isidorian decretals and the Gregorian decretals and all these papal decretals. Boniface VIII is going to do his own addition to this body of forgeries and falsities and usurpations and blasphemies. This Pope caused to be composed and published a new body of decretals, that is, papal decrees, entitled Sextus, divided into 5 books containing some decretals of his predecessors from the line of Gregory IX, and many of those which he made in his own pontificate. This collection was not only rejected in France, but there was even a time when nobody durst make use of it or quote it. Okay? So France had raised up an objection. We're not going to listen to any more papal decrees and decretals. All right. In view of all the foregoing facts, it's impossible to doubt about the origin of the temporal power of the popes, or that it was the result of usurpation, fraud, and forgery. Even acquired as it has been, it would have been acquiesced in by the Christian nations if the ambitions of the popes had not tempted them to extend it beyond the boundary of the papal states. Remember the papal states, supposedly given to the Pope by Charlemagne? It says, if they had been content to let it stand where the Gallican Catholics of France were willing to concede that it existed, in those papal states alone, the present Pope might yet have been King of Rome. The eloquent pen of Bossuet, which was employed to defend the independence of the Holy See so as to protect it from the jealousies of kings and princes. Yet he assigned to it the, quote, heavenly power of governing, unquote, only when it was, quote, under the protection of Christian kings, unquote. Not satisfied, however, with this, the popes have struggled for centuries with untiring assiduity to place all the governments of the world, let me say it again, to place all the governments of the world under their protection, to ignore the right of the people everywhere to construct their own governments, to make both kings and peoples obey them, that is the popes, to convert all the nations into one grand holy empire. Let me read it again. To convert all the nations into one grand holy empire. There's your new world order. With whomsoever should occupy the papal chair as its absolute monarch, and by these means to put the whole world under the Pope's feet. Passing along nearer to our own time, we shall have no difficulty in observing the progress of the struggle inaugurated by these papal usurpations, and in realizing how necessary it was to the happiness and especially to the freedom of mankind that these usurpations should be resisted. Man is only happy if he is resisting this Antichrist power in Rome. Now that's what France did. Excuse me. A little tickle this morning. I apologize to my listeners. It happens this time of year, by the way. Happiness only comes if you're a true Christian. If you believe that Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. You can only find happiness if you resist this counterfeit, this papal counterfeit. I'll tell you one thing, it has given my life direction and meaning and purpose. To extricate God's people from the delusion, the grand delusion that somehow, some way, this diabolical institution known as Roman Catholic is in any way, shape, or form related to the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of Christ. And to show God's people how it has so thoroughly deceived God's people. and the institutions, the governmental institutions that have sprung out of this Antichrist church, and how they manifest themselves even in our own governments, and how we have been made, unbeknownst to us, without telling us, we have been made to serve the papacy by obeying his laws, which are contrary to God's laws. Who are we going to serve? Are we going to remain in ignorance and leave ignorance to be the excuse? Or should we, like the French Catholics, rebel against this usurper and educate our brethren and sisters about this usurped authority over Christ's throne that counterfeits itself and masquerades as a church of Christ, hoping to unite all Christians under his sovereign spiritual and temporal authority? It's a reality that just absolutely must be comprehended. The author continues, and the lessons we shall thus learn will not only be instructive in this view, but we shall be compensated for the performance of the task of seeing the condition into which the world would be thrown if its progress were now arrested and the nations were thrown back into the darkness and superstition of the Middle Ages by the triumph of the principles announced by the present Pope. If forewarned, we shall ourselves to be blamed if we are not also forearmed. R.W. Thompson regarded this as war. And you can't fight a war in a foxhole. You can't fight a war hiding under the covers. You can't fight a war by sticking your head in the sand like some Christian ostrich. There's a deceiver in the world, and he's going about devouring any who come in his path. And he's hardly recognized, especially here in America. As a matter of fact, he's being ecumenically united with by those who call themselves Christ's people. Now, we're going to go on to the next chapter. We've just concluded chapter 13, and we're going on now to chapter 14. This is another busy chapter, a lot of very important history that has been forgotten, and history that most Americans within the sound of my voice have never heard before, because they've completely erased it from American history books. We're going to talk about native Britons, the Britons at the time of the Apostle Paul, as a matter of fact. So this is going to be interesting to a lot of people. We're going to talk about their religion before this so-called Roman Catholic monk Augustine darkened the British horizon. We're going to talk about Gildas and Bede. Augustine holds a synod with British bishops, and I'll just continue until the music starts. We're going to talk about his threats against them, the conversion of Ethelfrid, the Battle of Carlegion, and the murder of the monks of Bangor, Roman religion introduced, the effect of it, and Offa murders Ethelbert and the Pope pardons him. He establishes Peter's Pence. He accepts a code of canon laws from Adrian I. Boy, where did that first half hour go? It went so fast. We've moved on now to chapter 14 in the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, page 423 if you're following along. We're going to be dealing specifically with Christianity as it originated in England. Before I even continue reading the subject that we'll be discussing in this chapter, I want my listeners to understand a point that needs to be made. We all know of the parable of the wheat and the tares. The son's field, okay, Christ's field. It was sown with wheat, but suddenly tares were sown in as well, and tares began to grow up among the wheat. The wheat represents the true gospel of Jesus Christ and those who receive it gladly. The tares represent a lie, and they're sewn together. We're going to discover that the true wheat was early on in England's history planted by the Apostle Paul and those working with him. But that soon thereafter, the tares were sown in among the wheat. And I want you to know that it is the gospel of Jesus Christ that is the wheat, and we want my listeners to know who the sower of the tares are. That is Roman Catholicism. The truth as opposed to the lie. And as they grow up together, they're barely discernible. The difference is barely discernible. But only when the harvest comes, when the wheat grows into harvest, becomes white unto harvest, then the tares expose themselves. I believe that the body of Christ, that the culmination of history is white unto harvest. And now it is becoming apparent who were the wheat and who were the tares. This chapter of the book is going to show how the wheat was first sown by the Apostle Paul, and that how soon thereafter an evil one sowed tares in among the wheat, and that evil one was from Rome. We're going to talk about the custom and religion imparted in England. The Saxon kings willingly accept the doctrine of the divine right to govern from Rome. The Norman conquest, Harold, William of Normandy, the decision of Alexander II upon his claim, consecrated banner and the hair of St. Peter. I'm sure some of these things sound confusing, but they should pique your interest too as well. The Battle of Hastings, influence on England, celibacy introduced, example of the legate of Honorius II, Innocent III, and King John. He releases the subjects of John from their allegiance, holds all disobedient kings to be traitors to God, his claim of power and that of Pope Pius IX the same. Church and state united, Cardinal Antonelli and Papal Nuncio at Paris. He approves the bull Unigenitus of Clement XI, his theory of the imperfect power, its effect, a heretical king forfeits his kingdom, the Pope chooses a king for an heretical nation. Okay, kind of cryptic, but that's how R.W. Thompson begins every one of his chapters, but just little pieces of the puzzle that sound a bit confusing as I read them, but the text will bring it all together. Excuse me. Now we'll continue with the text. This is the beginning of chapter 14. Again, we're talking about the history of England, page 423. The working of the papal system and its influence upon civil policy are nowhere more clearly seen than in the principal events which led to the Reformation in England, the Protestant Reformation in England. As we trace the birth of our popular institutions back to the great uprising of the people there, we cannot fail to realize how manifestly it was designed by Providence as the means of breaking the scepter of ecclesiastical tyranny and giving freedom to the human mind. Having already observed enough to demonstrate the necessity for reform among the prelates and clergy of the Roman Church, we shall find as we go along ample means of comparing Protestantism with Romanism, and more particularly with that perverted form of it which is maintained by those who direct the policy of the papacy and exultingly calling themselves, quote, the princes of the church, unquote. Now here we're going to get to it. The native Britons had their own form of Christianity. existing apart from their druidical worship. Remember, these are Druids, the ancient Druids of England were imparted the gospel by the Apostle Paul. And this new faith existed somewhat side by side with this druidical worship, at least for a time. It said this Oriental Christianity of England existed apart from their druidical worship, which in whatsoever way it was acquired, they believed to be of apostolic origin. Okay? So these early Druidic Britons had received the gospel, and it was told of them that it came from the apostles. Now, upon this subject, there is much false teaching in history. All the papal writers affirm that Christianity was first introduced into Great Britain in the year 597. So let me just stop right there. If they didn't receive the gospel until 597, it had to be a papal gospel and not an apostolic gospel, right? But they had the gospel long before. Rome would have us believe that they are the ones who brought Christianity to Britain in the 4th century, or 597 A.D. But Christianity, it is proven by the best history that Christianity existed long before Rome ever showed up. The wheat had already been truly sown in Britain long before the wicked one planted the tares. It says all the papal writers, that is Roman Catholic writers, affirm that Christianity was first introduced into Great Britain in the year 597 by the monk Augustine and the missionaries who accompanied him from Rome during the pontificate of Gregory I. And many Protestant writers concede this, seemingly disposed without investigation to accept it as a fact because it has been so frequently and dogmatically asserted. You know, you repeat a lie often enough, suddenly it becomes fact. All right. There is nothing further from the truth, says R.W. Thompson, and the evidence of this is so abundant and conclusive that no intelligent man, if he will take the pains to examine it, can entertain any reasonable doubt upon the subject. Clement, who was a disciple of the Apostle Peter and a fellow worker of Paul, and who was bishop of the Roman Church about the end of the 1st century, wrote, now remember, this Roman Church, if Clement, the follower of Peter and Paul, were the bishop of a Roman church, you can certainly bet it was the church that Paul started. It was the true apostolic church of Jesus Christ, and it was in no way related or can in no way be confused with that latter tare church that was sown among the wheat that later became the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, Clement, who was a disciple of Peter and a fellow worker of Paul, and who was bishop of the Roman Church about the end of the 1st century, wrote his first epistle to the Corinthians shortly before his death, probably about the year 97 A.D. Referring to Paul, he says he preached, quote, both in the East and the West, unquote, and went to, quote, now this is important, listen to this, quote, the extreme limit of the West, unquote. Now, what is the extreme limit of the West? Now concede for a moment, before we even answer that question, the New World hadn't been discovered yet, so the extreme end of the West would have to be the British Isles. It just simply must be. Now, we know that after the Roman conquest of Great Britain, before the birth of Christ, remember we're talking about the Roman Empire, it was in power before Christ was even born. That's why Jesus said, these are the last days. This Roman power is going to be in power until Christ returns, according to Daniel chapter 2. Now, we know that after the Roman conquest of Great Britain, before the birth of Christ, the country was governed by a Roman prefect or proprietor who maintained his authority by a large military force and required the payment of an annual tribute by the native inhabitants. And we know also that the Britons were unable to expel the Roman magistrates and establish their independence until about the beginning of the 5th century. Hence, the conclusion is clear that if Paul preached in the extreme limits of the West, as the Scripture says, he must have gone to Great Britain and planted the gospel there. Or, if the expression of Clement be taken in a narrower and more limited sense, and Gaul be considered as the utmost field of Paul's labors, then we may conclude that the Christianity planted by him there was carried over to Britain by means of the intercourse between the Gauls and the Britons. So we can concede that if Paul's travels went no further than Gaul, or what we might consider Spain, is that correct? Yes, I believe it is. Then the gospel had to have spread from the Gauls to the Brits. But nonetheless, it was by Paul's preaching that the gospel came to Britain. Now, Eusebius and Theodoret both assert that Christianity was carried to Britain by some of the apostles, but without naming Paul or any other apostle. Tertullian and Origen both speak of it as established in their day, the first half of the 3rd century. And the former says distinctly that Christ was solemnly worshipped by the inhabitants. Irenaeus says that Christianity was carried to the quote-unquote Celtic nations, which includes the Britons. Baronius, the annalist, says that there was a manuscript in the Vatican Library at Rome which proved that Simon Zelotes, the apostle, propagated the gospel in Britain, and that Joseph of Arimathea went there about the year 35 and died there. Other authors mention the same facts, and Dorotheus, Bishop of Tyre, says that Aristobulus, to whom St. Paul refers in his epistle to the Romans, was the first bishop of Britain. Gildas the Wise wrote his History of the Destruction of the Britons in the year 546 AD, 51 years before the mission of Augustine, this Roman monk that is so widely believed to have planted the gospel in Britain. And it says, every page and almost every sentence of this book shows the existence of a British Christian church at that time. In other words, it pre-existed. This Roman monk, this Augustine, didn't bring Christianity to Britain. He brought Catholicism to Britain. The wheat had already sprung up, but it was Satan's purpose to sow the tares among the wheat, and it was brought by Augustine. Now, it is crowded with extracts from the Old and the New Testament and makes many references to the condition of the British Christians. At one place he says, quote, Britain hath priests, but some she hath that are unwise. Very many that minister, but many of them impudent. Clerks they have, but certain of them deceitful raveners. Pastors, as they are called, but rather wolves prepared for the slaughter of souls, unquote. So here you have an early British writer confirming that there was a mixture of truth with error, that there were those who were sent of Paul and had the true gospel of Jesus Christ, and that there were those who were sowing wheat among the tares. Now, in the same connection, he immediately speaks of the apostolical decrees, priesthood and episcopal dignity, followers of the apostles, the office of a bishop or priest, etc., thus establishing the fact beyond controversy that Christianity had been introduced and a British church existed long before Augustine was sent there by Pope Gregory. As to the time when this was done, Gildas is not very explicit, but he states quite enough to show that the British Christians in his day traced their Christianity back to the apostolic times. Referring to their religion, he says, quote, "In the meanwhile, Christ, the true Son of God, spreading forth not only from his temporal firmament, but also from the castle and court of heaven, which exceedeth all times, throughout the whole world his most glorious light, especially, as we know, in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, whereas in regard to that emperor, against the will of the Senate, threatened death to the disturbers of the professors thereof, religion was most largely without any hindrance dispersed of this infinite mercy, did first cast on this island, starving with frozen cold, and in a far remote climate from the visible sun, his gladsome beams, to wit, his most holy laws." Unquote. Now, I wish I was a little bit better reader, but this is very eloquent. The admission that Christ had sown the light of the gospel in Britain. Now, some have supposed that Gildas intended to assert here that Christianity was carried to Britain in the reign of Tiberius. But this conclusion cannot be reached without great confusion of dates. Tiberius died at about the year 37 A.D., and it was either during that or the preceding year that Paul was converted on the road to Damascus. The, quote, door of faith, unquote, was opened to the Gentiles about the year 42 or 43. The assemblage of the apostles at Jerusalem was about the year 50. At that time, it was agreed that Paul and Barnabas should, quote, go unto the heathen, unquote, that is, to the Greeks and to the Romans, and that Peter and John would, quote, go unto the circumcision, unquote, that is, to the dispersion of the Jews in the provinces of Asia Minor. Paul did not go to Rome until the year 60 A.D., when he went as a prisoner, and there's not a single word in all the Gospels to show that any one of the apostles visited that city before that time. It was undoubtedly after that when Paul went to the, quote, extreme limit of the West, unquote, to preach. And it is not likely that any of the apostles were there before him. Therefore, Gildas could not have meant to fix the reign of Tiberius as the time when the gospel was preached in Britain. And if his language be clearly scanned, it does not bear that meaning at all, although it is somewhat obscure. He must have meant to say that the light of the gospel began to spread forth during the reign of Tiberius, which is the fact. That Tiberius, quote, threatened death to the disturbers of the professors, unquote, of religion, and that when Christianity, having an opportunity to disperse itself, first reached the island of Britain, that this is his real meaning, and that he intended to assign the introduction of Christianity to Paul, is evident from the following language which he elsewhere uses, quote, which if ye for the confession of the true word of Christ hath, like the vessel of election and chosen doctor of the Gentiles, Paul, after suffering the chains of imprisonment, sustaining of shipwreck, after the terrible scourges of whips, the continual dangers of seas, of thieves, of Gentiles, of Jews, and of false apostles, after the labor of famine, of fasting, etc., after his incessant care had over all the churches, after his exceeding trouble for such as scandalized, after his infirmity for the weak, after his admirable peregrinations over almost the whole world in preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, through the stroke of the sword lost his head, unquote. Here, in speaking of the labors of Paul as extending over, quote, almost the whole world, unquote, the inference is unavoidable that he intended to include Great Britain, which, as a Roman province, was an important part of the world. But however this may be, the fact is incontestable that Christianity in Great Britain antedated or predated many years the mission of Augustine, the monk from Rome. And it is equally true that the British Christians had a church of their own, regularly organized, which existed independently of the Church of Rome. That's right, the wheat were already well sprung up before the tares were sown in amongst them. The tares were sown by the Roman monk, Augustine. They had the true gospel, whether it was given to them directly by Paul or whether Paul evangelized the Gauls and the Gauls took it to Britain, we care not to dispute. But the gospel of Jesus Christ first came to Britain directly from the apostles. And it was Rome, the counterfeit church of Rome, that sowed the tares among the wheat. And even Lingard, the great Roman Catholic historian, is compelled to say, quote, that the Christian faith was publicly confessed in Britain before the close of the 2nd century. And it is clear from incontestable authority, unquote, unquote. But he immediately, being Roman Catholic, surely he must put a qualification on this. Listen to what he says. But he immediately endeavors to break the force of this admission by insisting that after this time the race of native Britons disappeared from before the Saxons. In other words, the Saxons drove out these Christians and they lapsed into non-existence and were replaced by the Saxons. Therefore, Britain needed to be re-evangelized by Rome. You see how he disqualifies the truth, but this made-up piece of history? It says, but he immediately endeavors to break the force of this admission by insisting that after this time the race of native Britons disappeared before the Saxons, and that with them also disappeared their refinements and the knowledge of the gospel, and that the worship of Woden took the place of the worship of God. This is not probable, if it is even possible, says R.W. Thompson. It is a naked assertion without any proof to sustain it. Look, I have to believe that if God had wanted the gospel to be preached to Great Britain, that no Saxons would have driven it out of existence and left a void for the tares and the tares alone. We just have to realize that this was a divine mission. And all the most reliable history, the history that really makes sense, indicates that Paul did spread the gospel in Britain, and that the true gospel of Jesus Christ was known in the world before the Saxons and during the Saxons and after the Saxons, and the truth still resides in Britain if they just be brave enough to proclaim it. Now, Venerable Bede, another historian, refers to the desolating war carried on by the Saxons against the Britons, showing that the country was overrun by fire and sword, and the inhabitants, quote, butchered in heaps, unquote. But he says that some of them escaped to the mountains, some fled beyond the seas, and others led a miserable life among the woods, the rocks, and the mountains. Kind of sounds like the Waldenses, doesn't it? The true gospel God preserves in a place reserved for them, in hiding. But the wheat is never crushed out by the tares. Not ever. And that's the truth. Now, we'll continue next time on Inquisition Update to explore how Christianity was brought to England and our Protestant heritage. Been nice to host this week. I'll see you next week on Inquisition Update.